Bill Nye was once just a humble mechanical engineer turned comedian who decided to make a children's science to show. If you were growing up in the 90s in one of the shittiest and most underfunded and creationist overrun education systems in the Western world, this man all but was your science teacher. After his show ended, he became an advocate for scientific literacy. He had many high-profile debates with both creationists and global warming deniers. But then he suddenly became a crazy, corrupted Swiss shill. But Bill, not you. Look, I know that so many people are starting to catch this virus, but I never knew that it would be me, dearest Bill. He made me angry. I'm just trying to get my head around it. Maybe you can tell me. It seems as though the show had absolutely nothing to do with science. He made me very, very angry. There's only two genders. I don't need to do research. You are a representative of science. And you just shit over all of it. The world Bill Nye wishes to build seems to include rampant sexual promiscuity, dismissal of science in lieu of feelings, encouragement of sodomy. Ahem. All right. I think I went a little overboard on that. Ahem. All right. I think I went a little overboard on that. Ahem. All right. I think I went a little overboard on that. Ahem. All right. I think I went a little overboard on that. Bill Nye got a new show for Netflix, Bill Nye Saves the World, a show dedicated to furthering the work he did all those years ago, covering new topics and the changes to the old ones since that old show went off the air in 1998. And on one episode, entitled The Sexual Spectrum, he delved into explorations of sex and gender. And if there's something a true man of reason would never do, it's think about that stuff at all. I mean, he might be infected by, he might be feminism. Who is this empowering? It's empowering ignorant women. How dare ignorant people feel empowered? We can't have that happening, said the man in the Trump hat. And as a feminazi swidge myself, I figured I'd see what all the fuss was about. Let's check the episode out, shall we? I already saw the episode before pre-recording this. For a supposed Bill Nye's gone into the dog's nightmare freak show, he doesn't even really say all that much, in me opinion. He does a decent baseline covering of the topic and the general state of our understanding of sex, gender, attraction, and expression, and how all these things are essentially separate spectrums from one another, but he doesn't really go enough into the science behind it as I'd like, and he doesn't really say anything new to someone who's already read about this stuff. So, Tom, it was kind of disappointing. The segment in Korea was interesting, and it's fascinating seeing a culture with different approaches to gender norms dealing with new approaches to expression in its own way. But there's also a bunch of segments that restate what was already said, or which I feel should be kind of obvious by now to most people, in such a reductionist or over-the-top way that it feels like they were trying way too hard to make the topic, quote-unquote, entertaining, when the point of Bill Nye is that science is entertaining, you know. Science Rules, by Bill Nye, playing in the background as music plays in the background for a while. The musical number with Rachel Bloom, whom a crazy ex-girlfriend, which might just be the funniest show, whether you make it precise, so do the video, well, by the way, All you see, this is a new, well, well, that you see, well, they I'll come with you, come with you, well, with you, like, you have this vanilla cream right, and he simultaneously stands for, like, oppressive religious extremism and practices like conversion therapy, but he also, like, stands for heterosexuality and people who don't accept the existence of other ones at the same time. The segment conflates physical sex, attraction, and gender expression in a way that becomes confusing and actively makes the earlier segments trying to explain the issue as simply as possible harder to understand. Then, like, they rediscussing favorite flavors of ice cream when they are ice cream. Like, is this a metaphor for sex or cannibalism? Do they eat each other? Is cannibalism illegal in this ice cream-based universe? How do they digest each other? Do the ice creams fuck? Why would you do this? This episode gets across a lot of simple ideas lots of people have hopefully seen and heard before, like that trans people exist, or that other physical, mental, psychological, and personality-based aspects differentiate people far more than the genitals or chromosomes they happen to be born with. The other piece of terminology I expect a lot of people to be tripped up on is the part where he brings up the concept of gender expression. The more uniformed view of concepts like masculinity and femininity is that they re-linked directly to a person's gender, and along with that, their physical sex or biology, creating the expectation for prescribed roles and behaviors based on a person's sex or gender or sexual preferences. But the reality is that we see a broad range of behaviors that take place often irrespective of these things. This is something the community is far more ahead with than the mainstream. Take, for example, the concepts of butch and femme in lesbian culture. These are words used to describe the personalities of lesbian women. You can be a woman attracted to other women, but still express this very differently from other women attracted to women. Gender expression is a wider acknowledgement of this sort of behavior, and the idea that a person's personality is not something inherent to the other aspects of their physical biology, gender, or sexuality. To put it another way, I might be male and you might be male, but regardless, we both express maleness in different ways from each other and have to define for ourselves what it means to even be male in the first place. These sides of human behavior are fascinating and still developing fields of study, and the way they are glossed over by being talked about very briefly or turning up in the form of a mint chocolate chip ice cream fails to really get these ideas across very well, either in terms of summing up a subject you might be already familiar with or in introducing it to you for the first time. It gave a rudimentary, comedically slanted description of sex, gender identity, and expression that feels in itself a little too reductionist to be useful. It basically tells you that these things exist, which yeah. I have me own criticisms of the show, but I expect the rational raisins and smarty pants, scar bands of the world to have their own very different problems with the show. Let's look at a few in more detail and see if their problems hold water. Here's a video by one of YouTube's most prominent skeptics, and you know he's skeptical because he put it in his name. Armoured skeptic. I'm going to be using clips from both his video and various episodes of Bill Neef's new show, so to make sure I'm not taking anything out of context, I highly recommend that you watch his video and the show for yourself first. The links are in the description and by Netflix. The first segment is a skit where his persona argues with another version of himself, voiced by himself. Mondo respect. I think the guy is onto something with that. He goes into an episode-by-episode breakdown, summing up his opinion on each. The episode that deals with sex and gender is episode 9, but I'll briefly point out some aspects of Skeptic's perspective God that's a tongue twister on earlier episodes that I regard as illustrative of problems with his approach. Episode 1 was all about climate change, and this is how he talks about it. The first episode is about climate change, and I was a little apprehensive about this one because this is Bill's subject, but it was great. Bill was a little awkward in front of the live audience, but that only really added to the charm. But he doesn't get too political. He doesn't use too much hyperbole. He demonstrates how climate change is affecting the planet today, and even innovative ways that engineers are dealing with these problems. I even liked the panel. He had some guy on who said that he wanted the entire United States to be renewable, and another guy on the panel was like, no, that's a fantasy world. It was great. It was really well balanced. I mean, no, he didn't have any climate change skeptics or anything, but you know what I mean. He congratulates the panel for being well balanced. The focus is on balance, on not taking a side. So, is balance what we saw in that panel? Professor Mark Jacobson outlines that while it may sound impossible to some people, it is absolutely possible to make Mankind's energy infrastructure completely renewable. The main barriers are social and political. You can see how this science professor might have to risk getting a bit political here, you know, to fix the part where we all might die if it's not taken care. You can see how politics might have to come into it at some point. Meanwhile, Richard Martin, my main man Dick Mart, thinks it's utopian and unrealistic to think that, even though it's literally possible to actually do, there are many people in the world who dismiss ideas that actually could work in practice, and we know that because it's possible to check, because they've decided it's too utopian. He all but complains that there's no magic money tree. Where have we heard that before? He offers an alternative in the form of nuclear energy. Jacobs retorts that the time it would take to get the many thousands of nuclear power plants required to supplant traditional ones approved and built would fail to correct our impact on the climate in time. Dick Mart has no retort to this. He just kind of continues harping on how crazy it would be to do the thing that we statistically could do if we got our shit together. Like, bro, you trying to convince, like, millions of Americans to allow dozens of thousands more nuclear plants into their backyard. You gotta fucking explain how it all work. I even liked the panel. He had some guy on who said that he wanted the entire United States to be renewable, and another guy on the panel was like, no, that's a fantasy world. It was great. It was really well balanced. According to Skeptic, the panel is one person saying, I want America to be this really wishful thinking pea in the sky thing, like to have the entire United States be renewable, and another person being more realistic and dismissing it as a fantasy, something Skeptic has primed you to believe is a fantasy because he set it up like that. It feels like he's projecting the reality of America, like he's projected his ideas of the social justice warrior versus reasonable rational thinker discussion onto this subject. The problem with thinking this panel is balanced, or is supposed to try to be balanced, is that science isn't balanced. One of these guys was right. One of these guys you can check and it's actually true. The other guy was just, it's utopian. Just can't do it. Let's build thousands of nuclear plants faster than we've ever done before with magic. That'll solve it. He doesn't to get too political. I'm just gonna laser focus on this for a second. Skeptic appears, based on this and some comments we'll see later, to think that being rational and objective relies on not being too politically biased. But if you, for example, don't want mankind to die out, or want things to get better for people, and your focus is on finding ways to do this using science and facts and truth, then you are unavoidably going to get political. The current, though hopefully not for long, Prime Minister of me country closed a group investigating climate change and is about to get into bed with the DUP, a group known for, among other things, thinking being gay is a sin and climate change denial, and the current head of state in the USA thinks global warming was created by the Chinese in order to make us manufacturing non-competitive. When you say climate change is real, and people who don't think that are full of shit, you inherently making a political statement because people in politics act based on views like this. When you say you would prefer for the climate to not drastically change in a way that would be unfortunate for the bulk of humanity, you are unavoidably making a political statement. This kind of writing implies skeptic worries this scientist is going to get too political. I worry skeptic is trying to depoliticize a scientific problem that is very political indeed. This is just me speculating, but I am struck with the sense that upon reaching more contentious episodes based on science he's less familiar with, or which relate to pressing social and political issues of the day, skeptic was annoyed by nice alternative conclusions or ideas, and rather disagreeing with the right. But here's the problem with that view. What can we, as non-scientists, as non-brilliant engineers, do trying to be a realist? Vote. We yes. 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 Participate. Go ahead. He communicates that the episode isn't too political when Bill Nye overtly asks the audience to vote, which maybe would suggest not voting for people who think the entire issue is fake. He's being positive about this episode to cheer you up for when he gets political later by saying things he didn't already agree with, so he compliments the parts of the show he happens to agree with for not being too political. But Nye literally told you to vote based on the science. I would argue that the section of the show where Nye desperately shouts vote directly into the camera lens is one of the most overtly political things he does in the entire show. I am willing to bet a climate change denier would criticize this episode for being way too political. The place where I disagree with skeptic and me purely theoretical, incredibly stupid climate change denier who bears no relation to Stephen Crowder is that I think these problems inevitably have political implications and exploring them is intellectually honest and necessary for effecting positive change. By pretending this isn't the case, skeptic is setting himself up for the parts he doesn't like being bad simply by nature of being political. This episode is very clearly politically driven. When he talks about episode 2, he complains about the segment where Prashant criticizes the use of Asian mysticism imagery in quack healing to try and boost its cred, and he talks about it like this. A man named Prashant gets up on the stage almost as if he was going to perform a stand-up routine, but instead of making me laugh, he made me angry. He made me very, very angry. Prashant's lectured the entire white race on how it's soon acceptable to use Asian mysticism because it's from a different culture. What? Listen, listen. I know that it's tempting to do this. I know how so many people think that they've figured out the formula, but this needs to end. If you think that you re that one person in the entire universe who's figured out a way to talk down to an entire race of people and lecture them on how to behave without coming across as a racist asshole, stop. Because you haven't figured it out. It's impossible. Get this, though. Prashant says that he doesn't to believe in Asian mysticism, and he says that he doesn't like Asian mysticism. In fact, he says that he hates it. So why does it even matter? Who does it, then? You retrying to hog a part of your culture that you hate all to yourself. It doesn't even make any sense. What the fuck does that have to do with science? What does this have to do with saving the world? What even is this? Why the fuck is somebody talking about the white race on the Bill Nye show? After this, I'm pissed. I'm trying to watch the 3rd episode, but my blood is boiling. Okay, this segment is actually fascinating in numerous ways and almost makes me question skeptics' intellectual honesty in regards to accurately presenting the content of the show. It contains numerous falsehoods and omissions. The first false assertion is that this segment is about how Prashant was mad at white people for appropriating a culture that wasn't theirs. Prashant's lectured the entire white race on how it's unacceptable to use Asian mysticism because it's from a different culture. I don't want to do this to skeptic, but that's just not true. That isn't what happened here. Skeptic is attempting to accuse him of arguing about cultural appropriation, but he's actually talking about the well-known problem of quacks attempting to hide pseudoscience behind Asian mysticism. So you say it's magic and that it cures gout, and for good measure you throw in a Ganesh statue just to give it this ancient wisdomy feel. Prashant even name drops an infamous example who is himself of Asian descent, so he's definitely not talking about appropriation. It's actually the oldest trick in the book. Half nonsense, half Indian. It's called the Deepak Chopra. Why the fuck is somebody talking about the white race on the Bill Nye show? It seems like skeptic heard Prashant say, "Hey, white people," and then he turned his brain off and didn't see this bit. I'm genuinely curious if he remembers this part. The second false assertion is that this is a lecture. A man talking down to a group of people in some kind of mad, antagonistic, puritanical screed. This inaccurately represents the tone of the segment. Let's play back one of the brief clips skeptic uses of this part on mute, but with the sound on this time. White people, I love you, but stop using Asian wallpaper for street cred. I see what you redoing. This segment is a stand-up comedy routine. A stand-up comedy. The man performing this skit is a stand-up comedian. Part of the joke is the hyperbolic way he's talking down to entire races of people. That's right, races. Which is why I want to say something to me fellow Asians. Asians, lend me your ears. Stop convincing white people it is real. This is as much on you as it is on them. You know how gullible they are. Prashanth is being superlative for comedic effect to get across a quite genuine idea, and the audience is laughing along with it. This isn't a lecture in the slightest. The third false assertion is this one. And he says that he doesn't like Asian mysticism. In fact, he says that he hates it. Prashanth never says anything like this. He doesn't hate Asian culture. He hates it being used to sell remedies with no basis in science, regardless of race. Asians, stop selling unregulated remedies with no scientific basis, and white people stop using Asian culture to sell unregulated remedies with no scientific proof. Look, I get that cultural appropriation and how it's not a problem is a popular talking point in the skeptic community, but that doesn't necessarily mean everyone is always talking about appropriation, and treating this segment like one has caused skeptic to miss out on a point that I'm virtually like 99 sure he agrees with. These assertions are wrong, but you know, people make mistakes and have biases that impact how they view things. That's okay. I do that too, all the time. But where it gets kind of shady is when you stop and realize how this video is seemingly constructed on purpose to make sure someone watching this review without having seen the show wouldn't possibly be able to notice these claims are false. I'm gonna think like a video editor for a second here. When Skeptic was making this video, he had this episode of the show open in his timeline and he was scrubbing through it to look for bits of the show to put in his video to demonstrate problems or events he's describing. Prashanth makes his hyperbolic jokes and people laugh, and then he talks about a genuine manipulative tactic used by pseudoscientific quacks. When Skeptic talks about this section and how racist it was and how angry it made him, he shows only this brief clip with the show's closed captions turned on. He uses the section most easily interpretable to make this section be what he thinks it's about, namely, an Asian man resisting at white people, and the clip doesn't continue long enough to get to the actual meat of his real, though comedically slanted, argument. Also, I think this is accidental. There's another subtly manipulative thing happening here. You see, in some segments, Skeptic uses clips from the episode with the sound on so he can show them saying the thing and respond to it. This would be one of the prime sections to do it right. Like, he spends a good portion of this video harping on this segment. He talks about this bit of this episode more than he does for several entire episodes collectively. It would make sense to show the clip of him saying this and let us hear it. But if he did that, I see what you redoing. You'd hear people laughing. And no, Prashanth was ultimately making a joke. And this wouldn't jive well with skeptics' view that this was some kind of serious racist lecture at white people. Similarly, when he claims Prashanth says he hates Asian culture, it would have really supported his argument to show the clip of him, saying that or put it in the background while he talked, but he didn't use that clip because that clip doesn't exist. If he'd used a clip of Prashanth saying he hates when Asia culture is used to take people's money and sell forms of treatment or medicine that don't work. That would make him look like he was saying that, wouldn't say wait TV wait hazy high 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 be hey hey high be patty high high you high I will going way when this shoe this use this is that so he couldn't use that. I'd also like to go back and point out that he doesn't use any supplemental footage of the panel he talked about in episode 1. I think if it had happened the way he thought it did, he would have had footage to call on here, but instead its absence is rendered palpable. I don't think this is purposeful dishonesty. I think Skeptic had simply already arrived at his conclusions when he'd written his script, and when he was editing the video together, he just didn't notice the show isn't really saying what he thought it was saying. If you don't notice someone saying something you would probably agree with because of a little joke they made, it makes this video end up saying more about Skeptic's personal approach to watching media than the show itself, which I don't think is what he was going for. This is, to put it simply, political and ideological BS in action, and I think this is why Skeptic didn't enjoy the show. He even dismisses Prashant's segment as if it looked like it was going to be stand-up but wasn't. Now, Prashant is literally a comedian. I could make a defense of his act. You know, comedians like to push at boundaries, and that includes racial ones, point out that it's important to defend their right to do that, and also alleged mischaracterizing of people's racially charged jokes is he himself has railed against in the foremost second half of the video. Bill uses the term cis-male. Who better to talk about sex than two cis-male white goes? Cringe. This part of the video strikes me as really odd. Skeptic implies quite overtly that using words like cis is inherently a bad thing, but it's the counterpart prefix to trans and a very useful term when discussing these ideas. Unless, of course, he's not trying to imply that using the term cis is inherently bad. Maybe he just disagrees with the nomenclature. I mean, many writers in this field do prefer terms like non-trans as a way of making the subject easier to understand, but he doesn't elaborate further than saying cringe. So all I have to go on is Skeptic saying Bill Nye said a word, and it made him feel weird. Bill explains that there is no way to gender a brain by examining it, and then explains that just like biology, gender is also on a spectrum. Bill does not take this opportunity to discuss the connection between biology and gender. Instead, he just explains the spectrum as if there is no correlation between sex and gender. I found this a little disappointing because I wanted to know what scientists know about gender identity, but instead Bill just shrugs and moves on. Listen, Greg, you know, if you wanted to know what the scientists think about this, you didn't have to wait until Bill Nye got a new show like 20 years later to find out. You can just, check. You can look it up. Bill Nye is not the only source for what the scientists think about this. The previous episodes of the show, which he had less of a problem with, also don't cite the evidence in the precise way that he seems to expect, specifically when it's on a topic that he doesn't agree with or know much about. He doesn't to bring up the specifics of forcing or the ice sheets or planetary albedo in the climate change video, but that doesn't mean you should just assume there is no science, and it doesn't exist unless, of course, you read Steven Crowder. The show is simply trying to find a way to explain these topics to a general audience in a way that's not too complicated, and that's all right. Bill calls the fourth own expression. It's a way people express their gender. Bill, Bill, what's the difference between gender and gender expression? What even is gender expression? A good portion of this section of the video is skeptic incredulously asking questions he could literally look up in a matter of seconds. What is gender expression? How does it relate to gender? Is there a correlation with biology? Like, what percentage of the population expresses? There's a little secret with gender expression. It's made up. It's fashion. It's fucking fashion. It's fashion. Now, maybe it's wrong to hold skeptic to the same standards he holds Bill Nye to. I mean, Bill Nye is working on a fully produced show with a team of writers and researchers and, yes, comedians, but, well, skeptic doesn't explain either what the scientists think or why they think this or what the science is to support this conclusion he makes. He doesn't cite any sources to support this himself. He complains Bill Nye isn't being scientific enough, and then in the next few sentences leaps directly into an unsupported conclusion. He even, and this is the interesting part I wanted to get to, makes this comment. There aren't even any statistics or studies or psychological papers or polls or anything. Okay, here we are. The brass ring. This is what we in the tennis commentating business call an unforced error. Wait, no, that's golf. You see, when he dismisses this as fashion, there's some ambiguity there. If he just said that, you could interpret this as him saying he's done some research into the topic and come to the conclusion based on his reading that gender expression is a useless term. You wonder what he'd read and how he came to that conclusion, but you'd at least be able to credibly assume he'd looked at the academic writing on the subject at some point. But then he directly says, no research has been done and no papers have been written. And then, to make sure you know that's what he meant, he says it again. Bill says science is the process we use to understand nature, but there is no science about gender expression. Bill, that was just fucking nonsense. So I'm beginning to see why Skeptic had a problem with this episode. This episode would be really bad if it was based in absolutely no science, wouldn't it? Unfortunately, if you think that, I have some bad news for you. You might be wondering what these weird words and names and texts scrolling past the screen are right now. These are just a short list of peer-reviewed papers and studies specifically into gender expression and the nature of its relation with gender identity and biology. And believe me, this is a short list. You can find a much longer list by looking for the studies. So now, you and I know that there are studies into this. But Skeptic seemingly doesn't. He openly, directly denies they exist. How do you explain this discrepancy? Now, the cynical conclusion, the one I doubt, is that he doesn't care about the truth, really, and he thinks his audience is stupid enough to not check for themselves and they beliefs. But I think the alternative is more likely. Skeptic assumed there had been any research, and it didn't occur to him to check. This is a pretty big error. Like, it's a very quick to check. and the studies that result from checking are very informative and interesting and challenge the idea that gender expression is made up and equivalent to just trying to be fashionable. Even if these studies are flawed, or skeptic could offer an alternative reading that justifies the ideal's fashion, he doesn't provide that analysis here. And also, he can't because he doesn't seem to know they exist, which is kind of a problem when they do. Now, this is where I was hoping to get into the meat of the video. Right. Like, discuss interpretations and conclusions of studies and data, but we got all the way here, and it turns out that you, the viewing audience, are going to be denied the money shot of raw, hardcore data analysis because Skeptic has no data supporting his argument to analyze. He has no criticism of the existing studies which exist for me to debunk, and, in fact, he denies the existence of those studies. So, even pointing out that, yes, studies exist, the most rudimentary point possible, is enough to completely dash his entire argument against the rocks of reality. All his claims about gender expression, that it's all just fashion, etc., are predicated on the non-existence of scientific examinations that actually do exist. Even if those studies themselves proved that it was all just fashion and fake, how would he know? He simply hasn't checked. Maybe he has an epistemological problem with those studies, but to find that out, he would have to check they exist and see they exist and raid them and talk about them, and he's done none of those things. That's not the application of reason at all. Checking to see if studies into this exist takes literally as long as it takes a Google search to resolve, which in me case was 0.6 seconds. That's the quickest debunking I've ever had to do. There's two very clear reasoning problems here. The first is that, without any significant explanation that this is the case, skeptic situates it's fake and all just fashion as the null hypothesis for gender expression. He makes this the natural baseline from which all other conclusions must prove their case, but his, of course, doesn't have to, because he's decided it's the default state. This conveniently frees him from having to prove his assertions without any evidence. This is just the way things are, and if Bill Nye doesn't prove otherwise, or I can't find any studies showing otherwise because I can't find them or didn't to look for them, then I have to be right, and I don't even have to prove it. This is the exact sort of shifting of the burden of proof the atheist skeptic circle will be highly familiar with if they've ever encountered a presuppositionalist theist. Someone whose central arguments amounted to insisting that God's existence is how one should naturally assume the world is, and it's up to disbelievers to prove God doesn't exist, meaning they could dismiss people merely skeptical of positive proof without having to ever bother paying attention to what they have to say. Combining this with a disastrous inability or unwillingness to understand science or how evidence works, and they've built themselves a perfect box from which they'll never have to even think about leaving. Skeptic would doubtless see this flawed logic in an instant if he ever saw Satan, Bruv, and Kate making this kind of argument, but substitute the existence of God for the non-existence of gender expression, and here he is making that argument. Bill says we need to go with the science, and the science says we real on a spectrum. No. Yes, it's a trend. It's trendy for boys to wear makeup. It's trendy for girls to wear boaties. That's it. Don't push it. Greg, you know for a fact that boaties make anyone sexier, regardless of gender identity. Speaking of which, this booty was actually made for me by my mother. I wore this to a wedding. I was gonna put a joke here, but I just like this booty. It's really nice. Thanks, Mom. Then they proceed to give in to their urges and start licking each other like a bunch of fucking sluts. You know, I didn't like this segment either, but I wouldn't personally have slut-shamed the us cream. Sorry. Sorry. I just realized the words that I said. I mean, maybe I have it all wrong. Maybe it was just played for laughs. You know, like, maybe this is intentionally absurdist. Really. What gave it away, Greg? What part of the comedy cartoon ice cream licking party came across to you as absurd? Bill then uses mannequins to demonstrate that sex and gender are not really set in stone, biology isn't always clear-cut, and that the whole thing is relative. Okay, I'm fine with that. If this was Bill's intended message, then I have to commend Bill for saying this. Tolerance of people who don't fit social and biological norms is important. We don't have to treat to understand or relate to people, but we can at least treat them like human beings. Even if you are what they call a transtrender, I don't care. Be whatever flavor of ice cream you want to be. The message of tolerance is a good one, and I fully agree with that part. I've interrogated some of his arguments and laughed at his weird comments about the slutty ice creams, but I think it's really important that I leave this bit in here. A good portion of my response today has been about the often accidental duplicitousness of video editing, and I feel like not putting this segment in here would imply that he doesn't say stuff like that, and I couldn't abide doing that, so I thought I'd leave it in here. He puts this in here specifically because he knows there are people out there who think that trans and non-binary people don't have a right to exist, or in fact don't exist at all. And it's all just mentally ill people or trenders who are pretending. And it's important to take a stance against people being ridiculously shitty like that, even if the science didn't shake out in favor of their existence, which it does. The problem with Skeptic's video has nothing to do with any explicit bigotry. It's more to do with how he grasps the science and how he approached the show itself. And for a person who calls themselves a skeptic, not being willing to check if they are wrong by looking up the science constitutes something of a problem that I think is worth talking about. While I have very often and repeatedly satirized the language and implied values of the so-called skeptic community, I do actually also believe that skepticism and reason and facts and logic and evidence and all those other buzzwords are actually important. They do mean something, and they are worth thinking about. Greg doesn't seem like a bad person to me. You know, I make these videos and sometimes I'm really mocking of people. Either to be over the top because I think it's funny, or because I know their minds want to be changed because they re just so far out there. I am curious, now that I've definitively made him aware that the subjects exist if he does watch this video, if Skeptic will change his mind in accordance with the evidence, or at least develop a new perspective on the issues based on the stuff that I've pointed out. I think this is actually the first time I've genuinely thought, maybe some progress is going to happen here. Maybe someone's going to watch this and go, oh man, there is science and I missed it. That would be really interesting, wouldn't it? Although honestly, given the speed that discourse moves that on the internet, maybe he's already developed his opinion further. I don't have the time to watch all of everyone's videos nowadays because I am so busy making me own stuff, or, reading the studies. Science rules. Speaking of time, I did not intend for this video to get this long. I was going to cover a whole bunch of people in this video, and I ended up getting sidetracked completely by just one. Gosh, I've got to be at the airport in like 12 minutes. I've got to go. We'll cover the rest next time. God. Shit. Fuck. Jesus. Fuck. Where's the fucking briefcase? Oh shit.